Sure, they can share them, but I know some people.
All right, everyone, it's 11 o'clock, so let's get started. So I'm hoping to finish most of chapter 2 and the associated readings today. So that'll leave us with 2 more classes to finish chapter 3 and the associated readings, and that'll leave next Friday as test review day. And on that day, I will give you a pretty big hint about what each of the 3 written questions are. Those you should come in basically ready to go. Little housekeeping point, I won't be in office hours for the whole time today. I have something I have to do that's somewhat time sensitive, so I'll be there for around half an hour or so. Although usually people don't come towards the end anyways. So last time we finished with a discussion of reciprocal altruism. So I said last time that the 2 most widely accepted mechanisms for the emergence of niceness are kin selection and reciprocal altruism. A method or a process that's more controversial that I'll just discuss in passing is group selection. The idea here is we evolved in a context of tribal competition, and that there will be random differences between tribal groups in terms of gene frequencies. So some tribal groups may have a higher number of altruistic genes, for example, and that there can be evolution between tribal groups, that some tribal groups with more nice genes will outcompete the other tribal groups. I am not a biologist. My understanding from what I've heard from biologists is that the kind of consensus now is this is theoretically possible. You can model it happening, but probably the conditions for it didn't exist in human evolution. So there still are a few exceptions. So someone we'll talk about today is Jonathan Haidt. Jonathan Haidt is a defender of this. There's a couple other people, but they're very much in the minority, is my understanding. But it's theoretically possible. Another process that definitely contributes to changes in moral behavior is cultural evolution. So this is different from biological evolution, where there's a well-understood mechanism, namely genetic transmission and genetic mutation. We know that cultures change over time for various reasons. And that many of the moral intuitions we have, we don't get from our genes in any straightforward way. We are taught them through cultural transmission. Now, so there are different theories as to what the mechanism is by which cultures change. One that I'll talk about is memes, or mimetic, sometimes called mimetic evolution. This is, so everyone agrees cultural evolution happens. This is one theory as to how it happens, and this is controversial. The term meme, so the term meme that you're all familiar with, the version of it is like the things on the internet, but the term was actually coined by the biologist Richard Dawkins, and he wanted to make the point that natural selection can occur in non-biological contexts. All you need for natural selection to take place is you need some kind of inheritance, you need some kind of passing on of something, and you need some variants of some variants to be better at passing themselves on than others. So in the case of genetic evolution, there's different genes, and some genes will be better at getting themselves passed on than others. So in the North Pole or in Siberia, genes for white fur are going to get passed on more than genes for dark fur. The organisms that have the white fur genes will leave more descendants than the animals with dark fur genes. What Dawkins postulated is something similar could happen with ideas or behavior patterns. So memes are anything that can be passed on through imitation between humans. So it's not genetic. So it could be like a tune, There's random tunes that people hum, and some of them are catchier than others. The ones that are catchier will get spread more. You can think of them as kind of like mind viruses. Although I'm not saying virus in a bad way, just their ideas and behavior patterns can get passed on, and some are catchier or more spreadable than others. And so some people have argued that's how cultural evolution works. There are ideas, and the ideas vary in terms of how catchy or spreadable they are, and the ones that we have now are the ones that sort of won that evolutionary contest. There were various ideas on offer, and some ideas spread more. So we have a few different ingredients on offer now. We have kind of rudimentary, nice, or moral tendencies given to us by kin selection and reciprocal altruism, and maybe by group selection. And then once we have those, culture can modify and adjust those tendencies in various ways. So that's sort of the foundation of our moral nature. So this chapter in general is about whether moral tendencies are innate or not, and these evolutionary models are an additional line of evidence for morality being, at least to some extent, innate. So we've seen two lines of support for the idea that morality is innate. One is the baby studies, one is these evolutionary models, but there's one final piece of evidence for morality being to some extent innate, and that's studies of other animals, in particular, ones that we are closely related to. If morality was partly innate, we would expect, at least if it evolved before we diverged from other primates, we would expect versions of it to exist in our relatives. So there have been a number of studies looking for what you might call proto-morality, kind of like a more rudimentary form of morality in various primate species. So this is the Brosnan reading. So I'll introduce this by showing a video. I'll note the graduate student in this video, Sarah Brosnan, went on to become a professor at Georgia State University, where I did my master's. I never met her, but there's one little point of connection I have. Here's what the study involves. I'll briefly explain before showing it. So you have monkeys that know each other in this lab, and they have to do a simple task, like move a rock from one place and give it to the experimenter. And then they're rewarded with food, so typical kind of reward study. What they did, though, was they tried to pay the two monkeys unevenly, so unfairly. So one monkey gets paid the grape for doing it, and the other gets paid a cucumber. And monkeys like sugar just like we do, so the grape is a better reward. And the question is, how do the monkeys respond when there's this unfair distribution? And I'll let the video speak for itself. Okay, so for those of you who are watching online who didn't make it today, so the monkey that gets the cucumber throws it back at the experimenter after seeing that the other monkey got a grape. So this is what the paper calls first-order inequity aversion. So aversion means you don't like something, and first order means on behalf of oneself. So think of like first person, if that helps. So you're getting screwed, you're not being treated fairly, and you behaviorally show that you're not pleased with this. So that's first order inequity aversion. So this shows that, in this case, capuchin monkeys have at least a rudimentary sense of fairness, presumably to facilitate cooperation. Right? You don't want to be screwed. You don't want your partner getting more reward for the same behavior than you're getting. You want it to be equitable. Second order inequity aversion. So here's a picture from the public. So first order inequity aversion, you protest when you get the crappy reward. So you're protesting on behalf of yourself. Second order inequity aversion is some kind of behavioral evidence that you're unhappy even when you're getting the better reward. So the one getting the grade If they show any behavioral evidence that they don't like this, that would be second order inequity aversion. That is more rare among primates. The paper has a list of different studies studying both types. Pretty much the only species you see this in is chimps, which are our closest relatives. And that should make some sense, because this is kind of a higher level of morality. It's one thing to be like, that's not fair that I didn't get the grape. Okay, it shows some sense of fairness, but only on behalf of yourself. But to show a desire to equalize even when you're getting the better deal, that's a kind of more developed kind of morality. So in this case, the behavior is equalizing. So maybe you give part of your grape or the next grape you get to your partner. And again, you can think of this as evidence for morality being, at least a kind of proto-morality being to some extent innate, because obviously capuchin monkeys don't share a culture with us. What they share is a common evolutionary heritage. Don't worry too much about so there's two games that the paper discusses. These are used both with other animals and with humans. It's worth knowing what they are. You'll see them elsewhere in the literature. The ultimatum game. And the no choice game. In other classes, you may see this one referred to as the dictator game. So with the ultimatum game, one player, one animal or human, is given a set of points, tokens, food, whatever, and they have to make an offer to split it with the other partner. And the partner can either accept or reject this. And if the partner rejects it, no one gets anything. So you have some incentive to give the partner an offer that they'll accept, otherwise neither of you are getting anything. But also, of course, you have an incentive to have an unfair one because you want more grapes or whatever it is. In the no choice game, you make an offer and the partner can reject it, but that doesn't mean you don't get the grapes. The finding that the paper discusses, which is not very surprising, is you get more generous offers from animals when they're doing the ultimatum game, because there's some incentive to be more fair because the other animal can terminate it. And then the giver gets nothing. So not very surprising. So those are the key things that paper discusses. Any questions about the Brosnan? There's not too many key terms there, but any questions about that? Okay, so we've seen multiple lines of evidence that there is something like what the book calls a first draft of morality, something that our genes give us. The next topic is, or the next section is entitled, What's in the Draft? What are the basic building blocks that we are more or less born with? And here we're going to talk about Jonathan Haidt's 5 foundations. This is, I would say, one of the 2 most influential theories in moral psychology. One is Joshua Green, that we'll see later in chapter 8, but this is probably the other one. You could debate which one, but this is a very widely cited moral theory. Haidt posits that we have 5 basic moral taste buds, if you like, 5 basic ways of understanding morality. He argues that these are cross-culturally universal, although there's some differences that we'll talk about. And that each of them has an analog in other species, at least to some degree. So, what are the 5? These are good to know. They are care versus harm. So the basis of this one in our ancestral past would be, well, the earliest form would be like mothers caring for children. In some species, dad doesn't help out, but so this is, you're just unconditionally concerned for their well-being. You're not expecting anything in return. You're just like, I'm just going to be nice, make sure that they don't suffer, and not hurt them. The next one is fairness. So we've already talked a bit about that, right? So in a cooperative type relationship, or maybe even expanded out to all of society, but however broad it is, you care about distributing things equitably. This is probably related to reciprocal altruism, right? If you're going to cooperate with someone, you want both parties to pitch in. Next is loyalty. Sometimes called in-group loyalty. This probably emerges from our evolution as tribal bands, right? Where you're in small groups, you've got to pitch in, help each other out, and fight those other people. Obedience. So, or sometimes called submission to authority. Let me see which term there's different terms used in the literature. I should probably keep this consistent with, actually, the key terms says authority. I'll do the same as the key terms. But you get the idea, right? So there's some authority who you should submit to or obey. So this probably emerges, or the sort of analog in other species would be dominance hierarchies. Other social animals have dominance hierarchies where you sort of have a sense of who would win in a fight, of who would be on top, and resources are often distributed in that way. So listen to the top dog. And then the final one is sanctity or purity. So, in virtually all cultures, there are some things that are moralized, not because they hurt anyone, but because they seem just intrinsically wrong. So, for example, some cultures ban different kinds of meat, and if you eat that, it's like, no, that's just impure. You shouldn't eat those foods. Certain sexual acts are construed as being kind of disgusting and defiling. Cultures will draw those boundaries differently, but most cultures have some version of that. And this is thought to be rooted in the disgust system, which obviously has analogs in other species. Yeah.
Just to clarify, the care/harm one would also only applies to people in your group?
Good question. Probably when it originally evolved, but what we'll see in a second when I talk about political differences, the first two are less inward, in-grouply focused. They're less about just the in-group, whereas these three are pretty hard to separate from in-group norms. So this is going to relate to some of the political differences when it comes to these two. The top two versus the bottom three. So there's a reading on this. The first author is Graham. Haidt is another author, but Graham is a much more famous proponent of this. So it's better to think about it in connection with him. We're going to see a video of him in a second. So where these five have been looked into a lot is in the area of political differences between left and right. This has been looked at in several different cultures, and there's a very reliable pattern that emerges. The paper starts off by discussing the kind of general difference between left and right. Here it follows the work of a very influential economist named Thomas Sowell. So it probably doesn't take too much sociological knowledge to vet that a university instructor is left of center. even though I'm left of center, Sol is probably my favorite conservative intellectual. He wrote a very good book called A Conflict of Visions, where he talks about the different views of human nature that left-wing and right-wing people tend to have. And broadly speaking, the difference is something like this. Left-wing people have an unconstrained, sometimes called a utopian, vision of human nature, wherein human beings and human society can be perfected by the use of reason. And we can kind of keep getting better, keep progressing, and keep improving. And there's no limit to how far this can go. Whereas conservatives have a constrained or tragic vision of human nature, where humans are kind of intrinsically selfish, and that, look, the norms we have work well enough to constrain our worst impulses, and so we shouldn't change things too quickly. There's limits on how much we can improve society, and we shouldn't have utopian hopes for the future. So that's how the paper construes the difference between left and right. And then the question is, how will conservatives and liberals differ on these 5 foundations? And here we're going to look at one of the most well-replicated findings in moral psychology. And to simplify, before I show a video of Haidt, maybe giving a bit more detail, liberals are high on the first 2, this of course on average, there's always going to be exceptions, but on average, high on the first 2, and low on the next 3. The first 2 are sometimes grouped together and called the individualizing. Oh, and by the way, when I say liberal, the Europeans use the word liberal a bit differently than we do. I mean left-wing. Some people, by liberal, they mean like you believe in freedom or something like that. That's kind of the classical liberal tradition, but really I mean left-wing, which is more the American sense of the term. But anyways, so the first 2 are called the individualizing foundations. So you care about people as individuals, and at least when these become developed, care about them as individuals regardless of which group they're in. Whereas these 3 are called binding foundations. The purpose of these 3 foundations is to keep groups together. For the first one, that should be pretty obvious, right? Loyalty obviously is for keeping groups together. Obedience to an authority figure also serves that function. And as I mentioned with the purity norms, many purity norms also serve that function. All right, think of, again, religious prohibitions against certain kinds of food. Like, oh, that's impure. Part of what those do is they mark you as a member of the group. So liberals high on the first 2, low on the next 3. Conservatives are about equally high on all 5. That's the pattern you see cross-culturally. To discuss this more, I have a video we're going to watch some of, a TED Talk from Jonathan Haidt, talking about this political difference. He mentions George Bush and Al Gore. This video is a bit out of date, so if you're too young to remember, George Bush was the Republican nominee for president at the time, and Al Gore was the Democratic nominee in the kind of election before this TED Talk was given. The Republican Party being the conservative one and the Democrats being the left wing. Okay, so that website that he mentioned, yourmorals.org, it's listed in the video's document. If you're curious, you can try it out, see what your scores are. But that was a very good discussion of the 5 foundations. The general pattern that you saw there is very well replicated. Where there's some controversy is whether it's best to break it down into 5 or 2. This model was not arrived at through a statistical technique like factor analysis. It was arrived at theoretically, looking at which things occur both in us and other animals and cross-culturally. But these three cluster quite closely together, and so do these two, which kind of makes sense given the political differences. So some have argued it's more economical to have two foundations, but it's good to know the five. There has been a lot of work done on them. They try to validate these five in various ways. You can read the paper for more details. One of my favorites, and I think I have a key terms on this. Yeah, so one way you can, so obviously you can do a questionnaire, like how much do you care about this, but a more vivid way of doing it is asking people, how much would I have to pay you to violate these different foundations? So if you look at Appendix C, there's various examples. So for example, how much would I have to pay you to kick a dog in the head? So that would be the harm one. So if you feel like, ugh, like that's, you have to pay me a lot of money to do that, then you probably care more about the care and harm one. How much, for a fairness, one example is how much would I have to pay you to cheat in a game of cards played for money with someone you don't know? I won't go through all of them, but like for authority, this one always stuck in my head. How much would I have to pay you to slap your father in the face as part of a play that he agreed to be in? And even if you know that's true, it's like, oh, it just feels kind of wrong, right? And then you can kind of operationalize it that way. Like, how much would you have? Some of you are smiling. Maybe some of you would do it for free. I don't know. So how much you'd have to be paid to do this is another way of defining how high you are on these different foundations. Okay, good stuff. Before I move on to another application of this, any questions about the five foundations? Okay, some things that you don't have to worry about, but I'll just mention just in case you're interested. Some recent papers have suggested there's a sixth, so Haidt has said maybe liberty or freedom could be another one. Some debate about that. The book also discusses a slightly different model from Kumar and Campbell. You can read that if you're interested, but this one's much more well known, so that's the one to know for the test. And then the last bit that relates to the five foundations is a paper I was a co-author on. I didn't do any of the actual research. I was just recruited after it had been rejected. My supervisor asked me to kind of rework it and see if we could get it published, and we did get it published. And it's a kind of interesting application of this work. The first author was a New Zealand guy, Josh Leota, a very beautiful man. I remember when I first met him. I was really tempted to say to him, like, hey man, leave some women for the rest of us. But I thought, it's my first time meeting him, maybe. Anyway, so the paper used the five foundations as a way to test two different hypotheses about how threat affects our political beliefs. So there's two different theories: the conservative shift hypothesis and the entrenching hypothesis. So there are various lines of evidence finding that people's political views change when they're under threat. So there's some evidence for both, but the conservative shift hypothesis is that when people are threatened, they become more conservative, whether they start off as conservative or not. So the economy's not doing well, or some other kind of threat, and you kind of go, okay, we're going to stick with the in-group, less immigration, etc. So that would be the conservative shift. Whereas the entrenching hypothesis says, when you're threatened, you become more extreme in terms of whatever you already are. So if you're already conservative, you become more conservative. If you're already left-wing, you become more left-wing. So in other words, extremism is what people respond to when they are threatened. Does the basic distinction make sense? So here's what we did in this paper. Well, they mostly did. I just rewrote the paper. We had a experimental manipulation of threat. There's two different conditions. People are randomly assigned. In one condition, you read a newspaper article about how bad the economy is. In the control condition, you read a neutral newspaper article. So that's the kind of economic threat. And rather than directly test its effect on political orientation, we wanted to test the effect on moral foundations. So given how much evidence there is that moral foundations are tightly linked with political orientation, we wanted to see if it made people more or less extreme in terms of the moral foundations. And the evidence we found was consistent, I'll just keep saying it. The evidence the paper found was consistent with the entrenching hypothesis. What we found was, when it came to the purity dimension, which, by the way, is the one for which the largest differences seem to exist. So you saw that pattern in the video. The differences appear to be largest for the purity foundation, several studies found. And so what we found was, after threat, conservatives care more about the purity foundation. They report higher endorsement of this being morally relevant. And liberals report caring less about the foundation after being threatened. So, just one study. There's studies on each side, but at least what we found was consistent with the entrenching hypothesis, namely that people become more of what they already are after they're threatened. The fancy term for this, of course, if you know statistics, is an interaction effect, right? So political orientation and economic threat interact. The effect of economic threat on purity differs depending on whether you're liberal or conservative. And it included two studies, one of which was a pre-registered replication, which, as I'm sure, well, I guess we talked about this, as you all should know now, is very important nowadays. Any questions on the terms related to that paper? Okay. One thing I'll discuss as well, so Haidt kind of hinted at it in that video. He and others have used this to argue that, and they sometimes hedge this, they sometimes don't come out and say it, but sometimes they can be taken to imply that liberals are morally deficient. And it's important to remember here the is-ought gap. So Haidt is aware of this, so that's why he doesn't ever come out and say it directly. But if you say directly that these empirical findings mean that liberals are morally deficient, that is to violate the is-ought gap. You could make an argument, so the argument you'd have to make is something like this. You know, premise one, I'll write out. So premise one, you know, conservatives have more foundations. So the bad inference would be, therefore, you know, conservatives are more morally superior. I don't know how you'd say it, but it's somehow better. The missing premise would be something like it's better to have more foundations. The liberal take would be, well, no, the conservatives are adding things that aren't morally relevant. So you need a normative premise in there, something to do with whether it's better to have more or less foundations. You can't jump straight from the data to some kind of moral premise like it's better to be conservative or it's conservatives are more morally well-rounded or something like that. Or liberals are morally deficient. Okay, I don't think that video will add much. So I think that's actually a good place to stop. So that's all of the main stuff I have to say about chapter 2. Any questions before we finish? All right, we'll call it a day there. I'll see you all next class.